First and foremost, it's just critical that Métis people and their voices are at the table. And it doesn't matter if it's in terms of climate or biodiversity or human rights. It is so critical that Indigenous voices at large are represented. And the only way that Métis voices are going to be represented is if Métis people are at the table.
A number of different negotiations take place to make sure that the world is participating in, contributing to a solution for the climate crisis. And we need to make sure that the Métis perspective is included in those negotiations to make sure that any solution that is implemented doesn't infringe on Métis rights, has the specific space for Métis perspectives to be included, because Métis people have solutions to the climate crisis and they need to be heard. So there's a number of different reasons why we want to participate in international fora and have our voices heard.
I think there's a piece at international events that is missing around Indigenous inherent knowledge and rights to the land. A lot of the conversations are happening in big, large boardrooms with a lot of folks that aren't Indigenous, that don't have Indigenous connections or Indigenous understandings. And so we as Indigenous people have been stewards to the land for so long that we know what needs to be happening. And it's important that not just young people, but our elders, our knowledge keepers be brought into these conversations, because they are the ones that are tending to the land every single day. They are the ones that are unfortunately inheriting what is happening when we are dumping, when we are extracting. And it's directly affecting Indigenous people, and we've known for so long what needs to be happening, and therefore I think that's maybe why Indigenous people need to be part of that conversation, and Indigenous knowledge needs to be wrapped up into that conversation and brought into the forefront of climate action and climate justice.
So for me, the highlight was being part of the MNC delegation for the first time and showing the world who we are as Métis people, but also all of the Indigenous people that were there from around the world. The amount of women that were involved and the amount of youth that were involved, and how everybody is in tune with their protocol and their culture. And when we bring it together, it's so similar. And it was just a beautiful thing to witness and see that power within the Indigenous community. I'd never seen anything like that before.
Usually before one of these UN events, Indigenous people from around the world have been building these relationships for a number of years, decades really, to be able to come together and have a unified voice in certain spaces on certain topics. And so there's International Indigenous Caucus meetings that usually take place before these big events. It happens at COP. It happened at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, to come together to review the agenda, talk about the different topics, and really formalize positions on how we want to move forward. So it's a really incredible space when Indigenous people from around the world come together to formalize one strong position to advance together and really work together in this international space.
What I was really able to bring back was some of the conversations that were happening and looking towards some of the Indigenous folks in other parts of the world. What's interesting about COP is it brings in all Indigenous people from all over the world. And so to learn from other folks that are tending to the lands in different parts of the world, to bring that back and see what we can do and how we can help and support our brothers and sisters in their fight for climate justice, but also what is happening and what successes have they had and how can we implement that here.
The highlight of COP, honestly, was just the level of Indigenous solidarity within Montreal, within the space at large. And that isn't specific to COP per se. It typically tends to be that way in any of these international spaces, is that Indigenous people just connect with one another, and it's like a magnet. And so being a part of the MNC and La Femme Michif Otanemsac delegation was really special, to be able to showcase our Métis solidarity and then connect more globally as well with other Indigenous folks.
I think there's also an element of truth and reconciliation that comes into play in these spaces, especially for Indigenous groups from Canada and North America, and I guess you could even say throughout the world. A lot of the legacy of colonialism has been driven by resource extraction. Those two things can't be separated, and that's a truth. So how do we reconcile that? How do we move forward in truth and reconciliation now that we've acknowledged that truth? And I think this is a stage, well, COP and these different UN spaces are stages where that can be done, where Indigenous folks can speak their truth. Métis can speak their truth around how resource extraction has impacted their communities and their lives, their livelihoods, their cultures, their ways of living, and how climate change that as a result of that resource extraction-driven colonialism also continues to impact them and future generations. There's an opportunity for Indigenous folks, for Métis folks, to enter the conversation and speak the truth about their realities and how these things have impacted them and how there can be better inclusion and reconciliation of these things. I don't think resource extraction is going away. I don't think it's going to stop impacting Métis ways of life or Indigenous ways of life, but I do believe that there is a way to reconcile that and to have better inclusion of Métis voices, perspectives, ways of living, livelihoods in resource extraction. I think those things are inextricably linked, and they're also inextricably linked to climate change and how we extract better, more equitably, and thinking for generations ahead as opposed to the next balance sheet.